Thank you very much. I was very touched to be invited a couple of years ago to join the jury for the Ryman Prize, which seemed like an excellent new initiative, and was even more thrilled when David heard that I was going to actually be in Australia at a conference and said, would I like to come over and present this year's prize to Henry. And I have to say, just to reiterate what David said, that there was an overwhelming feeling among the jurors that Henry was really the outstanding candidate. So congratulations again, and thank you so much for a very lovely acceptance speech. Given that I was coming all this way, David said, why don't you talk to us? And I just happened to have a new book out. And so, having done a variety of book tours, I said I can talk a little bit about my book. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, I run a research institute at Oxford which is on population aging. Now, it is true that most of us in this room are interested in the aging bit of population aging. But to be honest, the reason that, in fact, the whole world is aging isn't really just about the fact we're all living longer. It's actually we're having fewer children. And if you look at the sort of demographics of it, it's just that women across the world, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, have dramatically reduced their childbearing. We took about, in this part of the world, in Australia, the States, most of Europe, we took about 150 years to reduce very high levels of fertility down to below replacement, which is roughly below 2. So in most advanced economies now, women are having fewer than 2 children. What we're seeing in other parts of the world, for example, in Asia and Latin America, is a dramatic fall, typically in one generation, where women who may have had 8, 10 siblings, they're having 1, 2, or actually are remaining childless. So the dynamics that drove us to reduce our childbearing and took about 200 years, roughly 150, 200 years, have happened almost overnight in one generation in the emerging economies, particularly the middle-income countries. And as a consequence, we only find really that it's in sub-Saharan Africa that we're still having these very, very large families. And because of that, the whole world is aging. And whereas we actually have had quite a long time to prepare for our aging, Asia and Latin America are aging in about 25 years. I've just come, as I said, from the International Federation of Aging conference in Brisbane yesterday, and at the end of my talk then, the finance minister from Mauritius came up, and she said, we currently have got 6% of our population over 60. Within 25 years, we will have a quarter of our population aged over 60. That's how quickly it is happening in some of these countries. So, as I say, we've had quite a long time to prepare for this, but obviously in other parts of the world, they're having to get their act together very quickly. We, in the advanced economies, became old in terms of having more people aged over 60 than under 16 at the turn of the millennium. Asia will have more older people than younger people by about 2040. And as a consequence, the world pyramid, and we all know if anyone's done any population studies, it's this kind of shape, lots of young people coming into economies and driving societies. Now, already advanced economies are more or less the skyscraper. That's really good news. It's really good news because it means that everybody who is born has a really good chance of growing up and living long, healthy lives. And how long these lives are likely to be, I'll come back to at the end of the talk. But it does mean we have to adjust our society. Within Europe, within about 15 years, we will have half our population aged over 50. We've never had a region of the world where half the population is aged between 50 and 100. That means really adjusting to the kind of society that we're going to live in. It's changing our economies. It's meaning that actually, if we didn't have migration, then we really would be very desperate for skills and young people coming into our economies. It's changing the kind of health profile, and I'm sure this is something you're all very familiar with, but the really big health question is around the context of the fact that aging of a population means that there is more ill health in your population. There's a change in the kind of ill health, very much towards what Henry was talking about, not only Alzheimer's, but other chronic diseases. So we move away from acute and infectious diseases over to chronic diseases. But also it changes the capacity of the society to care for older people requiring long-term chronic condition care. And that means that as we all know, the health professions have real problems getting the skills they need because there are fewer young people wishing to go into those occupations and fewer young people in the population. And secondly, families are getting smaller. So the ability for family care to be provided is getting smaller. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about something that's been happening in the UK, and then I'm going to refer to some ideas that have come out of the book. I actually was talking to your minister a few minutes ago about the UK, who has just introduced, we've just had a 2.5-year review on the ageing of the UK population. And I was invited by the government to chair this and actually to sort of frame what we did. And we decided that we were not just going to focus on pensions and long-term care, although that's important. We were going to focus on everything else. The way that the UK had to change to accommodate this dramatic population shift in its average age. So we commissioned large pieces around changing world of work, changing world of education, the way our housing had to change, the way our public environment and infrastructure had to change, what was going to happen to our families, and how were we going to be able to harness technology, given actually that many of the barriers are public acceptance of new technology. So this report is just coming to fruition, but one of the things that we've been looking at, for example, is something that the minister mentioned, which is having to work longer. It's about lifelong education. It's about using new technology, seeing the home as a place of care and a place of work and not just where we live. So how are we really going to transform the UK society? And what I want to do now is actually just take you through the sort of demographic transition of the world and end up again with what I've just been talking about, why it is that we can't really just look at pensions and healthcare, why we're going to have to look at the whole way in which New Zealand, Australia, all the advanced economies are going to have to really change the way we live, and actually Asia and Latin America is now preparing for that massive change that they're going to see by the middle of the society, by the middle of the century. So in terms of demography, one of the things that we now realize is that the aging of the global population is actually responsible for the increase in our world population. So many people say to me, we've got to stop women having children because our world population is growing out of control. Well, it's not actually growing out of control because, as I said, women are reducing their childbearing quite dramatically. But what is happening is that if you look, go back to that global pyramid now is roughly like this. It will be almost a U shape by 2050. This bit are all the people in particularly Asia and Latin America who are going to do what we do, which is expect to have long, healthy lives. And we're going to go from 7 billion now to about 10 billion by 2050, and quite a large proportion of that 3 billion are the older people who would have died but are still going to be alive. So in other words, an older person is alive, their children are alive, their grandchildren are alive, their great-grandchildren are alive, where all these multi-generations being alive at the same time are actually driving the growth of the world population. And that's a good thing. We shouldn't see it as a negative thing. We do have a slight fear that childbearing in sub-Saharan Africa is still between 4 and 8 children on average. But so long as we can focus and conquer this, then actually world population probably will stabilize at between 10, 12 billion. But the increase that we're going to face inevitably is to do with increasing longevity. So let's just start thinking about how we got there. I want to look back at the 20th century. How did we get us all living as long as we live? And then look at what is likely to happen across the 21st century. What messages from the world we've just left can we see happening in the world we're about to come to? To put it in some kind of perspective, in 1850 in Europe, half the European population was dead by about 45. Half died in their mid-40s. Now, half the European population can expect to live to their mid-80s. We've pushed back death across the life course. And those people who, and I know here in New Zealand you're considering it, they're definitely considering it in Australia, we within the UK are considering it, pushing back pension age in the light of longevity. Well, the message from history is this, that when Bismarck introduced the pension into Europe, in the middle of the 19th century, he set 65 as the age at which you would get an old age pension. Half the population was dead by 45. So if we extrapolate the fact that we're all alive till 85, our pension age should be 103. So warn your politicians of this. So how did we get there? So in 1850, we still have death across the life course. Then through things like we improved our nutrition, we improved our sanitation, clean water. First of all, those very vulnerable parts of our population, babies and young children, they stopped dying. As we came into the 20th century, we stopped women dying so much in childbirth and associated things to do with reproduction. We then introduced vaccinations, which started at the end of the 19th century and started coming through. We had antibiotics, penicillin by the middle of the century, and as a consequence, by round about the 1960s, 70s, when we introduced geriatric medicine, we were beginning to push death not across the life course, but really increasing the longevity of the over 65s. And currently, if you look at the decline in mortality rates, the fastest group at the moment that are declining in advanced economies are those people over 65. In other words, we really are tackling deaths among the over 65s. And the really big question is, we may stop people dying as they get older, we're pushing back the onset of their death, but what about frailty and disability? Life expectancy is increasing, but are we also increasing healthy life expectancy, or are we just keeping people frail and disabled? And that is a really, really big question to tackle. And I think one of the answers can be, if we look at what caused death and what led to chronic diseases emerging through the 20th century, and how that may change across the 21st century. So let's just look at what happened in the 20th century in terms of mortality. And I'm going to talk about English men. And the reason I'm going to talk about English men is actually the male story is particularly interesting, as you'll see in a minute. But also in England, we have very, very good data. We've got very good historic data. Sweden and England have some of the best historic mortality data. So we really can map, particularly across the 20th century, things like our mortality rates and our fertility rates, etc. So if we just look at the main causes of male mortality last century, we can say that they were infections, they were respiratory diseases, they were cardiovascular diseases, and they were cancer. And if we take what happened, for example, with respiratory diseases, massive, massive peak in respiratory diseases at the beginning of the 20th century, First World War, the flu epidemic, and then it started to decline. So much so that very few people now die from respiratory diseases. Obviously, older people are susceptible to pneumonia, bronchitis, but it's tiny compared to the kind of deaths we saw among our older population at the beginning of the century. Infections, same story. Very high deaths from infections at the start of the 20th century. A great peak in the First World War, another peak in the Second World War, but basically, since antibiotics arrived, it's flattened out almost completely. Only the very old, the very young, and people with compromised immune systems nowadays die from infections. And those of you who are going to turn to me and say, but we all know about antibiotic-resistant bacteria, aren't we all going to start dying of infections? Yes, it is true that there clearly are concerns. My colleagues who work on infectious diseases, however, say that they believe we will always keep on top of infections. Part of that is because just as we map the genetics of the humans, so we also understand the genetic components of all the pathogens. The only problem is that it will come at a cost. It is going to be very costly in the future to conquer infections. Doesn't mean we won't be able to do it, but the era of cheap conquering of infections through antibiotics probably has gone. But still we can say we're unlikely in the developed world to return to a situation where people are dying from infections in huge numbers. That probably has gone. The cancer story is interesting. If you look at it, it's flat across the century. We don't seem, in terms of death from cancer, to have made that much progress. And my cancer specialists at Oxford say that is because the incidence of cancer has gone up considerably, but actually we have kept people alive with cancer for longer and longer. And the reason why we've got more cancer in the population is probably partly to do with lifestyle. You know, we eat too much, we drink too much, we don't take enough exercise, we smoke, etc. But on the other hand, we've got much better keeping people alive with cancer. And obviously the aging of the population has contributed to the incidence as well. So cancer is a bit of a sort of flat story at the moment. But the really interesting one is cardiovascular disease. And if you were to look at what happened to cardiovascular disease among men in England last century, it was high until 1981, and then it plummeted. And men stopped dying of lung cancer, stroke, and cardiovascular disease in such numbers that it comes out in our national mortality figures. Does anyone know what happened so that men stopped dying of cardiovascular disease? Smoking. Exactly right. What had happened is that in Oxford, Richard Dole had made the connection between smoking, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, heart attacks. And that happened in the 60s, and the government introduced a massive public health campaign to stop men smoking, and it worked in such numbers that men who used to traditionally die from heart attacks in their 50s and 60s declined dramatically. And the really interesting story is it was a public health initiative that had a massive impact on reducing male mortality. And if you look at the figures, male life expectancy has actually increased far greater than female life expectancy. And we've had a slight closing of the gap in Britain. And part of that story is in Britain because of the reduction in deaths from smoking. So we can say that if there was this public health initiative that stopped the big scourge of the 20th century, which was smoking, what about the 21st century? Because I think if smoking was killing people in the 20th century, without any doubt, the really big public health scourge that we all face in the developed world and in the developing world is obesity. And the really interesting question there is, how are we tackling obesity? Because how we're tackling it, I think, has real implications for what I was talking about earlier. What will our old ages be like in relation to the fact that we may have had lives with obesity? And I just want to draw your attention to a very large survey, or couple of surveys, which I really think begins to give some kind of answer to this. It just so happened that in Oxford in 1975, we started something called the Prospective Cohort study. And this was a very, very large study which started to look at obesity. At that time, it was more overweight, although obesity was beginning to be recognized as a problem. And between 1975 and 1995, it was a very, very large OECD study. And it was actually stimulated by the Americans. And I don't know whether there are any Americans here, but America does not do well on the health rankings. If you look at the OECD health rankings, America is below average in terms of both morbidity and mortality. And the Americans obviously don't like this. Part of the reason they don't like it is that they put more money into their healthcare system than any other country in the world, but it doesn't seem to be having that much of an impact. Now, there are all sorts of reasons as to why there is. Part of this is the huge inequality in their society. But one of the ideas they had was that the growing overweight or obesity in their population may be responsible for reducing their life expectancy. So the question was, if we had less obesity in the population, would life expectancy be higher? So just remember that question. That survey then finished, and exactly the same survey was started out of America by a group led by, it was called the Chiang survey, and it ran from 1995 to 2005. And it did exactly the same. What is the contribution of obesity to possibly reducing life expectancy in these OECD countries? And the really interesting thing was that when we compare the two studies, we can say that in the first study, roughly the decline in, or the reduction in the expected life expectancy, obesity accounted for 44% of that. And in the second study, it accounted for only 22%. So half the reduction in the expected life expectancy in the second study, when we had a real explosion of obesity in OECD countries, explained than that in the first study when there was far lower obesity. And the reason seems to be pharma. that as obesity has increased, we have not tackled it in the way that we tackled smoking, which was public health. We stopped smoking. Rather than us stopping eating, stopping drinking, and doing more exercise, we're popping pills. And our doctors are giving us statins and blood pressure tablets and all sorts of things, keeping us alive with obesity. And that is not a good message going forward. And there was a recent analysis done in 2011, which I think really highlights the problems of a growing obese population for the future healthcare of older people. And what this study did was it looked at the over 55s, and it took three issues. It took smoking, it took alcohol use, and it took obesity. And it asked, what is the impact of these three on life expectancy and disabled life years? So if we just take smoking, we can say that roughly if you smoke, you reduce your life expectancy by about 3 years, and you increase your disabled life before that by about 3 years. Alcohol is roughly 2 years and 2 years, but obesity only reduces life expectancy by about 1.5 years, but increases disabled life expectancy by about 6 years. And the reason that this is important is because as we're having longer lives, so whether we are fit and healthy doesn't just impact upon your world, the fact that we will have a lot of frail older people, but it also impacts on all other aspects of the economy. Right at the beginning, I talked about the aging of societies. Aging of societies being a reduction of young people in our society and an increase in older people. Now, every OECD country cannot attract the skills that it needs to drive its economy. The OECD recently came out with a report that showed that from 2017 on, there will be more people leaving our workforces than entering our workforces. In other words, retiring rather than coming in as young people. And that took into account skilled migration, how much skilled migration we could attract. So from a societal point of view, one of the ways in which we can conquer this is by working longer. So if we're going to be living into our 80s and 90s, and if we're going to be keeping fit and healthy in our 50s, 60s, and 70s, there is obviously no reason why we shouldn't stay active and contributory within the labour market. Also, given these long lives, given the world economy, it is very, very difficult for people nowadays, unlike our parents, to retire in their 50s and live on a wonderful defined benefit contribution for 40 years on the standard of living that you've had whilst you were working. My father, who died last year, he worked for IBM, he retired at 54, and he died at 87, having been on an IBM pension longer than he was an IBM employee. And he was very proud of this. He really wanted to live long enough that he could say this, and he did it by about 2 years. But even he said, it is crazy, you know. For 30-something years, I've been on a fantastic pension. He was a sort of one of that lucky generation. He could live the kind of lifestyle he and my mother had always had when they were working. That world has now gone. So we are going to have to work longer. But if we're going to be frail and actually disabled and have comorbidities, etc., it's going to be very, very difficult for us to do that. And that's why this story is not necessarily a good story. And that's why understanding life expectancy versus healthy life expectancy is so important. But I just want to finish by saying, how long are we going to live? Now, one of my colleagues at the Institute did some modeling for us about 2 years ago, and he produced these figures, and this was on how many centenarians Britain could expect to have by the end of the century. And we looked at this and we said, no, you're wrong. Go away and do it again. This cannot be right. And about a month later, ONS, the Office of National Statistics in the UK, which is not a particularly sort of extreme radical organization, came out with exactly the same figures. And these are, so there are currently 12,000 centenarians, people who are aged 100 living in the UK. By the middle of the century, there will be 500,000, and by the end of the century, there will be 1.5 million centenarians in Britain. And you can do this for all the different countries, and I'm sure he will do it, if you like, for New Zealand, and you can probably work out the sums yourself. You're going to have, I would think, around about 150,000, given the size of your population. If you look at the real life expectancy of babies that are being born in this country today, it is probably around about 104. Now, you will say, no, 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 the life expectancy in New Zealand for women at birth is something like 83, 84. Now, that is because how we standardly do life expectancies are, for every baby that's born today, if today's mortality conditions continue across her life, she will live till she's about 84. But they're not going to. We know they're not going to. We've seen dramatic increases. I've already shown you. We've doubled our life expectancy in 150 years. We are adding on, I think, isn't it, 2 years a decade at the moment. We know that new technology, we know that the new genetics, we know that drugs, we know that stem cell research and nanotechnology is all going to help us live longer and longer. So if you look at the real life expectancy, and these are serious demographers in different parts of the world have done these calculations, in nearly all the developed countries, over half the babies that are being born today are going to live to a century, and we're talking about life expectancies of 104, 106, 107 in Japan. The century of the centenarian, which is what my colleague calls it, has arrived. It is here to stay. And we also know from Japan that if you look at, Japan has quite a large number of centenarians already. What about supercentenarians? Henry talked about the longest-lived woman, 122. The longest-lived man, I think, is 116. If you look at pushing back, as we get more centenarians in Japan, are we getting more supercentenarians? Yes, we are. I think it is highly likely that we will seriously have life expectancies of 110, 120 in this century. I don't know if any of you have heard someone called Aubrey de Grey, who thinks we're going to live to 1,000. I was at the Cheltenham Science Festival last week, and they put me on a panel with him, and it was a bit of a sort of battle trying to persuade him, and most of the audience actually, that we weren't going to be living till 500 this century, which is one of his ideas. But I think we are going to see those kind of numbers. The first-born supercentenarian, that's somebody who can live to 110 or over, he was born in 1788. He fought with Napoleon. At that time, there were about 10 centenarians in Europe. So we've always had long-lived people. We know that the human body is capable of lasting to 110, 120, for example. And when you look at the new technology that's coming along, which will support longer lives, there is a real possibility. Yes, we may push over 120, yes. But I think there's a real possibility that more and more and more of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will expect to live to a century. When my grandmother died, she died in the 60s, and she died at 73. 70 years and 10? Good life, everybody said. Now, if you meet someone at 73 who dies, you think, what a shame, how young. So our expectations obviously have changed in light with the fact that we are all going to live longer. So to conclude, that really, I think, is the big story. We are going to have longer lives in the future. I think we are going to see the reduced childbearing across the world stay. We are going to go from this kind of pyramid into a skyscraper. We are going to have to get used to the fact that over half our population will be in mid to late life. 50 to 100 will become the norm for half of many populations, and we will have to adjust our societies. And as I said right at the beginning, I think the fact that the UK government, who is making some crazy mistakes at the moment, potentially with Thursday on the horizon, but I think in terms of really trying to address its population in a very holistic way and understanding it really has got to tackle work and education and housing and our public spaces to adjust to our older population, I think that is the way that all advanced economies are going to have to go. So thank you very much.